Here in Vermont and throughout a lot of New England, right, we have these forests that are very young, that are very simple, that haven't had time to develop all of these qualities that we might find like in an old growth forest that have defined forests for thousands of years. The qualities, the conditions that all of our native biodiversity is adapted to, right? Because that's where they evolved for thousands of years. And, you could look at these young, simple forests and be like, there's so much missing. What a loss and what a sad, awful thing. Or you could look at these forests and be like, what an opportunity. We have an opportunity to, if we're willing to make some tough decisions, if we're willing to do some work, to rediscover a capacity for life and for beauty in those forests that hasn't been known on this landscape for centuries.
Hello and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Ulrich, and I'm also the founder of the mothership website of this podcast called The Goodness Exchange. We've written thousands of articles and interviewed hundreds of people who are doing things that are just going to change our shared future in remarkable ways. And today we're going to talk to one of them that I am just so delighted to talk to. Ethan Tapper is a forester by avocation and in his heart, and he is also an amazing author. Now, if you're a reader, you'll know a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. You'll know some beautiful books, Rachel Carson. You'll know books that bring you to another place, another sense of possibility. And that's what Ethan does with his book, How to Love a Forest. And you can see how much I love his book because I literally could not stop annotating it almost every page. Ethan Tapper has blown me away. I'm going to give you one example before I turn this whole conversation over to Ethan. So maybe draw you into why this work is so fascinating. I think most of us in this world look or driving down the road, or we own a piece of land or whatever. We go by the town forest or what have you. And if we see a whole lot of sort of like untouched trees, they're just standing there doing their job, all nice and green, we think, great, the forest is fine. Or if we walk into that forest and it just looks idyllic. It's just, we can see 200 yards through the forest and it looks like parkland. We think, great, this forest is on it. This is the world that we all inhabit. And then if you have a piece of ground that's been treated roughly, you think, well, I'm just going to leave this alone. People have damaged this land for hundreds of years, and now that I'm taking care of it, we're just going to leave it alone and nature's going to spring back. So this interview that you're going to hear is with someone who's thinking some seriously fresh thoughts about that approach and how things have gone too far. There's just no way we're going back to this beautiful world that we have the opportunity to recreate without actually thinking it through and making really conscious choices. So this is why I wanted to introduce Ethan's new way of thinking about how we manage forests. And so really welcome, Ethan Tapper.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'll tell you, your book brings us all into this world where the modern and the civilized way that we've arranged things in the world meets the forest. Like, we are inseparable from it. And I never realized that quite as well as I do now. So I thank you for that appreciation.
Sure thing. Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of what I like to talk about and write about is these ecosystems, right? And ecology and natural history. But then there's a lot of nuances to that. And one of them is just the fact that we live here, and that we can't really totally separate ourselves from these ecosystems, which are not just essential to our lives and to our quality of life, but which include us, and which we affect all the time. And so that's really, as we think about these solutions to these ecological problems, humans have to be a part of it.
Give us some of your story, because this is kind of important, how you got here. It's something I like to point out about innovators, people with fresh ideas like you. How you got here is it seems so serendipitous.
It is.
And yet it seems that you are exactly where you should be. And we're all on these life journeys. And I'm always encouraging people to look at their life journey as exactly what it should be, not a detour, not passing time, but exactly what it needs to be to get you at some point to what you're uniquely built to contribute. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. One of the fun things about being interviewed about this book and getting to do so many like book readings is that people always want to know how I became a forester, how I ended up writing this book, and so like a superhero, I get to have an origin story, which is fun. For those of you who are listening, I would recommend to try and craft what your origin story is, because the practice itself is valuable, where you go back and you're like, oh yeah, I was doing all these things that at the time seemed random or haphazard or whatever. And, oh, this got me to this place and this got me to this place. And it's a cool exercise. So anyway, as best as I can figure it, what happened to me was that I grew up in this little town called Saxton's River in Windham County, Vermont. It's like 300 people and it's surrounded by forests. And when you hear these other biologists, ecologists, nature writers interviewed about their childhoods, they often are like, well, I was the nature kid, and I was crawling around the dirt, looking at bugs and tracking deer and catching frogs. And that wasn't really my experience at all. I do not remember being interested in forests or ecosystems or having any idea that was going to be a big part of my life. What I do remember very strongly is that I wanted to get out of there bad. And I remember when I was a junior in high school, I told somebody, I was like, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont, because everybody goes there and I'm getting out of here. Well, first month of my senior year of high school, I got this letter in the mail. It told me I got this scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship, which is a full tuition scholarship. And I was like, oh, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. No integrity, no principles. I was just like, okay, we'll do that. And went there for a couple semesters. And I didn't know what I wanted to study. And I was just kind of bumbling around, taking random classes. And I was still with my high school girlfriend and the first big love of my life. And she was coming back at the end of my second semester from this 5-month wilderness expedition, this program that she'd been on. And she'd had this huge, impactful, important experience. And I had not. I'd just been like, bumming around at the University of Vermont, playing beer pong in my dorm room or whatever. And we weren't connecting. I was 18 years old and I was freaked out. I thought we were going to break up. And so I said, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going on a wilderness expedition. And the next one left in 2 weeks. And it was a 6-month expedition. We skied north for 3 months. And then we built a canoe and canoed back down. And now in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship didn't work out. But then after that, all I wanted to do was be in the woods. Totally changed the course of my life. And then I worked as a wilderness guide. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt with a fir bough floor in the woods of Maine for a year. I worked with draft horses. I was an apprentice with a draft horse logger for a while. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me I had to come back or I was going to lose my scholarship. And so I remember sitting on the bough floor of my yurt and holding a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont in my hands. And I scrolled down and I saw forestry and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it had the word forest in it. So I said, cool, we'll try that. But one of the interesting things about, my journey that sounds like parallels your journey, and I think a lot of other people's journey that I really wanted to speak to, is that during this time when I was like working in the woods, and living in this way that I felt was like very intentional in these ecosystems, was that my point of view at that time was that these people who are like cutting down trees, loggers and hunters and people like that they were screwing up the forest, and that all they had to do was just get out of the way. And that I had discovered like the only real, true, compassionate, responsible way of, relating to these ecosystems. And the rest of my life has been sort of figuring out what a limited understanding that was. When I was in forestry school, there's a lot of cool things about being a forester. One of them is that imbued in us is the idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can see what's going on and then we can do something about it, right? And I call it like the beauty of action. And the other thing is, the veil starts to be sort of like pulled away from your eyes, where you start to realize that all these ecosystems that you think of as like pristine and perfect and peaceful are actually dealing with all this stuff, that most people, when you just walk through the woods, would never realize. And then you realize that we have all these tools to help solve some of those problems and to help not just like make ecosystems conform to some vision that we have for them, but to help them be themselves and to help them rediscover all these qualities and all these capacities that are missing. And so then, you start to stand there and realize that to do nothing in the face of all these things and with such a tremendous opportunity to help ecosystems would in many cases be like an act of negligence.
Now, then the book hole concept comes up, because that's another story that I feel like we're all gifted. Now, talk to us a little bit about that, because I got to tell you, Ethan's writing in this book is just beautiful. And I had to just say to him, hope I didn't hurt your feelings, like, wow, this is like E.O. Wilson sort of, kind of writing, Rachel Carson. But I hope I didn't insult you, but like, where do these words come from?
Yeah.
Talk to us about how this whole book writing thing came up.
So the whole process took a really long time, and I didn't know how to do it. I'd done a little bit of like creative writing in high school, and I did a little bit of like informational writing, which has a really different tone in my professional life. But, I just really wanted to, there were some things I wanted to talk about. One of them, right, was this idea that the only way that we can love a forest is to leave it alone. And then seeing these forests that needed a lot of help. And I wanted to speak to that and show how sometimes these actions that we can take, even one as counterintuitive as cutting a tree, can be these profound acts of love. And I didn't know all that when I started, but I just had a sense that I wanted to start writing. One of my biggest gifts was that I figured out that my mind is the most creative and productive for writing the first hour that I'm awake in the morning. So for me, that's from 5 to 6 a.m. And it just became this like beautiful practice that I did every day, where I would just get up and I'd be drinking my coffee and I would write for an hour. And the other thing that's neat about that is that, I didn't know how to write a book. I didn't even believe that I was capable of writing a book, but I could write for an hour, and so I just did that every day for 6 years, and it added up. And everything that the book is, the message and the tone, is all just sort of was born out of that time and that practice. And it feels like a very sort of, to me, a very magical, mystical thing, because I don't really know where it came from. It just happened to me.
And I think your story is a good metaphor for anything that people feel like is inside them that has to come out. It could be woodworking. It could be practicing a musical instrument. It could be absolutely anything. That's just giving yourself over to it for an hour a day.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, I think it was really helpful to me in a lot of different ways. And one of them is that I wasn't trying to like do the whole thing at once. And if I had been trying to do that, I there's no way that I would have done it, because it would have been too intimidating, too scary. And there's actually a lot of parallels. So I talk a lot about in the book. I talk in the book a lot about my land, which I call Bear Island. And at the same time that I was writing the book, I had bought this piece of land, and it was like the most degraded forest that I'd ever seen. And if I had been like, I'm going to heal this ecosystem today, I would have never even gotten started. And what I could do instead was to offer it what little I had a day at a time. And remarkably, what I've seen over the last 7 years that I've owned this land is this incredible transformation that couldn't have been accomplished, I believe, if I was trying to do it all at once. That could only have been accomplished through just, offering what little I had in that moment and persisting.
That's really the gist of it, isn't it? Is this persistence. I think our society really wants instant successes or instant outcomes.
Yeah, I think I worry, because now I've just worked away at this stuff, and I get to talk about it on my social media and all these other things. And I made a reel about it recently on Instagram, and about like, I know that you all are thinking that like I know how to do all this stuff. Like I'm on there and I'm like running equipment, I'm running excavator, and I'm like deer hunter, and running a chainsaw, and like building a sugar house, and doing all this other stuff. And I realize that's really intimidating. And I want to make sure that you all know that I didn't like know how to do any of this stuff. And how did I figure it out? Like, I tried to do it, and I asked for help, and I failed constantly, and I just didn't stop. And then it turns out that if you're persistent, and you're humble enough to ask for help, and to know when you're out of your depth, that you actually can learn to do a lot of different stuff. You just got to try, and you got to and be willing to fail and to continue.
You said to me during our pre-call, you said, I figured out writing just like I figured out how to drive an excavator or a skidder,
Yeah, like, you just get, you get in the cab, you get in the cab, and then you like don't do a good job, and then you keep going, and eventually it's like 5 years later, and you're like, oh, I kind of know how to do this now.
Let's take a little quick break, and then when we come back, we'll start with some of the actual aha moments I got out of this book. You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time, or maybe even the emotional stamina, to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back with Ethan Tapper. Ethan's an author and a forester, and he's written an amazing book called How to Love a Forest. I'm on the local NRC board. My husband's on another conservation board here in Northern Vermont. And my daughter actually is on an education board in Maine. And we all three were told about this book at the same time. And, right there, so the stars are aligning. I made a quick contact with Ethan, and we're fortunate to have him with us here today. So this book is about how we think about beauty and our connection to the natural world, in my mind, and how we free ourselves from some unhelpful notions about what we do next. I'm a steward of a nice piece of Vermont farmland that's kind of been really treated poorly over the years. And my thought was that we should just leave it alone, let nature take its course, and everything would be beautiful and wonderful in 50 years, and I was willing to wait for it. Turns out that's exactly the wrong strategy. Ethan points out through chapter after paragraph after sentence a more helpful way to think about where we are now and how we get to a new place in repairing what's happened to forests. I'm going to open it up by just reading you a sentence, and I'm going to have Ethan read lots of parts, but this is what got me really interested in the book. It's on page 9. He says, "In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent, this is a vision both for how we manage our forests and take care of our ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other." I knew I was in this book for the long run when I read that, because this book is not just for folks who care about conservation or have any interest in, taking care of their backyard or their neighborhood forest or whatever. This book is about how we live together. And like I mentioned in the opening, there are so many beautiful metaphors in this book that we can all use to think about how we get along in our family and what those dynamics look like and so forth. So I want to start here with a part of the book that you say you really wanted to be sure we talked about, and that's the topic of beauty. Let's skip all the way for a moment here to the end of the book. I think that's nearer the last chapter. But, I'm always, one of the things that I like to remind people is that we don't always have to look for the truth. You know how truth is so all over the place these days. I always look for beauty, and I find truth way more often. So when I see somebody who's just being a beautiful person, or I see some outcome that's just beautiful for everyone, there's the truth there somewhere. So talk to us about your beautiful concept of beauty.
I think one of the things that I talk about in the book a lot, it's a book that I think is clear-eyed about where we are, and the many threats that our ecosystems face in this moment, which are substantial. And it's also a book that's about hope, and it's about this incredible, tremendous opportunity that we have in this moment. Like, this moment is not just an ending, and it's a beginning. And it's an opportunity to create a world that is so much more vibrant and abundant and full of life and full of beauty than any world that we've ever known. And there's a terrific metaphor because, here in Vermont and throughout a lot of New England, right, we have these forests that are very young, that are very simple, that haven't had time to develop all of these qualities that we might find like in an old growth forest that have defined forests for thousands of years, and that are the qualities, the conditions that all of our native biodiversity is adapted to, right? Because that's where they evolved for thousands of years. And you could look at these young, simple forests and be like, there's so much missing. What a loss and what a sad, awful thing. Or you could look at these forests and be like, what an opportunity. We have an opportunity to, if we're willing to make some tough decisions, if we're willing to do some work, to rediscover a capacity for life and for beauty in those forests that hasn't been known on this landscape for centuries. And I think it's such a blessing and such a gift that we get to live in this world, in this moment, right? And to live in a world that I say in the book, where so much is wrong and there's so much worth saving, right? There is so much that is here. It's not just about what's gone, it's about what remains, right? And, one of the things about the book too is it's pragmatic, and this is a vision that I'd never seen in a book before, where it's like, we don't just have to hope that those things return to us and that we find our way back to them, but we can make them happen, right? We can be stewards of this land, and that can be active, and that can involve us making a lot of tough decisions. But if we're willing to do that, we can actually move somewhere positively. So I say a lot that, like, I think that we focus a lot on mitigation, on like stopping the bleeding, on this, like, our loftiest objective, right, is that we just create a world in the future that just isn't any worse than it is right now. And that's like the most that we hope to achieve. And I'm really not interested in that at all. What I'm really interested in is this act of generation and regeneration in building something and building a better world.
Now, one of the really big topics in this book, an aha moment, is about the orchard problem. Is that, and the book is full of things like this, but he talks about the fact that we humans have this mentality that a forest ought to feel and look like an orchard. And it could come back from our human evolution, that we want the forest floor to be clear and we want to be able to see forever. Give us the whole scoop on this. A forest should not look like an orchard.
Sure. So one of the big themes in the book, as well as many other things, relationship and responsibility and power, freedom, is humility, right? And so one of the things that with these ecosystems is so humbling is that, I've walked in the woods in my professional life with thousands of people. And one thing that I find is so consistent is the sort of instinctual view that folks have of what a forest is supposed to look like. And, I call it the cathedral, right? So it's these big, evenly spaced trees and this tall, arching canopy. And you can look right through the understory and just see it a mile. And it's so remarkably consistent. And actually, I've seen people really put in an enormous amount of time and energy to make their forests look like that instinctive vision. And I've seen tons of people judge their forests or others' forests that don't look like that and be like, wow, you're doing something wrong, because it's supposed to look like, like a park. And as you mentioned, there's a bunch of different explanations for maybe why we have this vision. One of them from that guy you mentioned, E.O. Wilson, who's one of my heroes, Edward Wilson, amazing biologist. He's actually a myrmecologist, which is an ant scientist, and the guy who really ignited my love of biodiversity. He suggests that there's actually a bunch of research indicating that we are predisposed toward ecosystems that look like savannas, which is really what that vision of that forest looks like. And he suggests that it could be because our species evolved in these savannas for tens of millions of years. And that on some level, like every other animal on Earth, we have instincts. And our instincts are drawing us toward our habitat. And that's the habitat that we evolved in for a really long time. There's a few other ideas. Like another idea is that it's part of what we call shifting baseline syndrome, which is where we just assume that the conditions that we're used to are normal. And the forests that we're used to on this landscape kind of look like that, because many of them have regenerated from these abandoned fields, agricultural fields, pastures, clear cuts within the last 60 to 100 years. And they're often this single generation of trees that are evenly spaced and with these tight-knit canopies, so there's nothing growing in the understory. They have these clear, open understories. So wherever it comes from, one of the really interesting and humbling things that I've realized and I try to share with folks is that an understanding of what a healthy forest looks like is not something that we're born with. We don't just come equipped with the ability to understand. And it's something that we need to develop. And it is, in fact, counterintuitive, right? It will make us uncomfortable because we have to sort of go against those instincts, because that vision, the cathedral, right, that is so pleasant to us, has nothing to do with what forests are like. It has nothing to do with forest ecology. It has nothing to do with biodiversity. And it just has everything to do with us. So something that we have to do and that we get to do is to sort of go on this journey to discover what a healthy forest actually looks like. And then by extension, like what it means to care for it.
And what does it look like?
It's very humble. Yeah. So when we look at, it's very interesting. Like here in New England, we had this incredibly pervasive land clearing, especially in the 1800s. And then many of what are now forests were then maintained as agricultural land for the next 100 to 150 years and have since reverted naturally back to forest, but they've only been a forest for like 60 to 100 years, which is no time at all. for a forest. But we do have a small amount of our remnant old growth forests left. In Vermont, it's like less than 0.1%. And the interesting thing about studying those old growth forests is that shows us what forests looked like on this landscape for thousands of years. And then, the conditions that all of our native species adapted to for thousands of years. That's what it meant to be a forest on this landscape for millennia. And what they look like is, yes, they have some big trees, as you'd expect, but usually not a lot, like 10 to 12 big trees per acre. They are equally defined by what we call in the ecological parlance structural diversity or structural complexity, what I increasingly call multi-generationality, which is just many different sizes and ages of trees, all of these different generations of trees, each resulting from a time when trees died and the forest regenerated again and again and again for thousands of years. They are equally defined by the presence of dead wood on the ground. And something that I really enjoyed telling people, which I think is also very instructional to us as humans who have our own relationship with death, is that this process of tree mortality is as normal and as natural and as ancient and arguably as essential to the ecology of these forests as living trees. There are literally thousands of species of living things that find their habitat in the death of a tree. And they also contribute to all of these other things that are really important, like contributing to healthy forest hydrology, seed beds for future generations of trees and plants, building healthy forest soils, and a million other things. A forest like that offends our every aesthetic sensibility. It looks messy, right? And that messiness in ecological terms is what we call complexity. And the way that forests have always been on this landscape until just the most recent couple of centuries, and the way that we need to help them be, if we want them to be really healthy and resilient and to be providing habitat for all of our native species, is to leave that vision, that cathedral, that neat and tidy and orderly orchard-like, park-like forest behind, and instead actually embrace that messiness.
Yeah. Okay. So, I love this analogy. Right back at you with the cathedral analogy. You use this on page 55. You say, the fullness of summer envelops the mountain. The forest is a centuries-old house, its doors hanging on their hinges and its windows milky and broken. So I love, and then you go on. I mean, you can see how much I annotated and underlined and scribbled. So talk to us about this whole concept, the forest sags under the weight of an unkind past.
Yeah, I think about that sometimes, that, we have these ecosystems, these forests, and which are, by the way, certainly built around the living structure of these trees and defined by trees, but are, of course, so much more, tens of thousands of different species, billions or trillions of organisms that may be found in a single handful of forest soil. And they're just incredibly complex and ancient, and there is so much there. But when I walk through the forest, I see both the reality of how beautiful this ecosystem is and how much is there, and then also how much is missing. So it's like you're in this old, beautiful house, that was built. When it was built, it was ornate and, built with care and compassion for, a beautiful, big, happy family, right? And now you can still see that. You can still see that house is there, that the structure is there, but it just needs a little bit of help. It needs a coat of paint. It needs some rotten floor joists to be replaced. It needs some new clapboards. It needs a new roof. And none of that, right, would be like us just being like, we need to demolish this house and start over. It's all about like, here is this beautiful thing that we inherit, and we have tools to make it healthy again. And so when I look there, it's sort of like seeing both like the shadow of something beautiful that once was, and then also like the opportunity for in the future to help it be that again.
I love the opportunity. I have to say, Ethan is teaching us through the whole book about what we're seeing when we walk through the woods. I thought beech trees were supposed to be all bumpy and cracked. I come from Illinois where it's oak hickory forests, and I guess I may not even know what a diseased oak or hickory looks like. I guess I do know what a diseased oak looks like. Yeah. But here in Vermont, I didn't know that they're supposed to have this smooth, silky bark and so forth. So throughout this book, you will learn about the trees and the ecosystems that you pass on your walks with your dog, in your own yard, in your neighborhood, your park. And that's a beautiful thing. I'll tell you something else that's a great thing that I can't stop seeing now since you mentioned it. Talk to us about a wolf tree.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, wolf tree. I don't know how widely used this term is, but we certainly use it here in the Northeast. A lot of folks do. And what this is basically a big old tree that for a time was standing alone by itself. And, that history is evidenced by a lot of different things, by its advanced age. Like a lot of them will be like 150, 200 years old, but also by their growth form. So instead of going straight up in the air, as trees do when they're competing with neighboring trees, there was no trees around it. So it just reached out these huge lateral branches in every direction to form this like globe of a crown. And, there's a couple different theories actually about why we call them wolf trees. I had always heard that it was because they stood like lone wolves in the middle of these pastures. And one of the things that, I wanted to talk about in the book, and I wrote this, one of the chapters in the book sort of follows this wolf tree along throughout the history of its life of the last few hundred years. I would, be walking through the woods and I would see these wolf trees and I would think about, in air quotes, what this tree had seen, right? Or what this tree had experienced in a way, what this tree had lived through. And with many of those trees, right, it's possible that tree was a sapling in an old growth forest. And that it was being like, it was a part of these communities of which we now know very little that used to cover our landscape, a world that we can't possibly even imagine.
I got to interject here that I think, I'm not sure very many people realize, you think of Vermont as, mountainous and green forests forever and maple syrup and all that. But there was a time when 80% of Vermont was cleared to the ground for sheep, right?
Yeah. Yeah, in the 1800s, we went from like 95% forested to 20% forested in the length of a single human generation, like 30 years, with axes and crosscut saws and draft animals.
Okay, and then there's where the one tree would be left to spread its as a shade tree that would just be able to spread its branches as wide and arcing.
Yeah.
I know those trees. I see them. We have some in our forest that for some reason they didn't cut, and it all makes sense when you see it. It's
remarkable because you're out there in these forests, and that's what I tell people about forests in New England is like every forest you've ever been in, unless you were in one of our like few remnant old growth forests, which we know where they are, was cleared in the 1800s and probably was cleared as recently as like 1900, 1930, 1960.
Probably all across North America.
A lot of it. Yeah. I mean, more of the clearing was more Eastern United States, but yeah, certainly all over the place have had these really extreme impacts. And, and all over the place have had places that were clear that then regenerated into forests or have been planted. In other parts of the country, there's these really extensive tree plantation forest management that happens. Anyway, so you could have had this tree that was in an old growth forest. All the trees were cleared around it in a very short period of time. And then it just grew up alone in an endless pasture for hundreds of years. And there was cattle and sheep, seeking shade under its canopy in the middle of the summer. And then 100, 150 years later, a forest, that pasture went fallow, those livestock went away, and a forest regenerated around it. And it sort of, became a member of this biological community that we call a forest again. And so it's remarkable to see those and be like, you've been here for it all, big guy, these big, beautiful trees. And and they're witness to a lot of different things.
You mentioned that a wolf tree eventually becomes the center of a drama.
Yeah, I think another thing that we think about with these big old trees is, messiness again, right? Like a lot of times they don't look like the healthiest, most beautiful tree in the forest. They don't have a beautiful straight trunk. There are a lot of times they'll have these cavities, these holes. They'll have this canopy that is, full of both living branches and dead wood. They look kind of gnarly and weird. And yet trees do this amazing thing, which is that every stage of their lives in these forests are these incredibly generative and important moments for the life of that community. In fact, there's a whole community of organisms, I call them the necrosphere, that's their habitat, is the death of a tree or the decline of a tree. The trees live this moment that we call the perimortem period, the period that precedes death, that can last, in the case of a tree, centuries. There's actually a saying from Europe with English oaks, which live a very long time, like 1,000 years. And in Europe, I've heard that they say that these English oaks grow for 300 years, and then they rest for 300 years, and then for 300 years, they gracefully decline. And all of the interesting thing about it is, like, we have this mentality that everything has to be productive, and everything has to be healthy. And yet, as these trees decline and fall apart and die, I say that they become decentralized. They become filled with all of these different organisms of the necrosphere, fungi and bacteria, invertebrates, all kinds of critters, birds and mammals that are using those cavities, that rotten center of those trees for nesting and denning habitat. They become this incredibly important habitat for so many things. And even when they die, when they fall on the ground, they are just this beautiful and foundational part of these forests. So it really makes you sort of, one of the other factoids I should say about these dead trees is that in the forest, a dead tree can have 4 times the biomass as a living tree. So it really makes you question, right, what it means for a tree to be alive. If in death, it can harbor so much life.
I want you to talk to us about chapter 6. Is this the freedom chapter?
Freedom.
I can take a quick look. Yeah. Okay. To hear you talk about freedom and how it relates to this, it's diagnostic of the book, folks, is that you think you're reading a book about the forest, but I can't stop thinking about it in daily life. I just went to the grocery store and I thought about this book and something I saw happening there. Talk to us about freedom and how it relates to the forest and what it reminds you of.
Sure. Yeah. And I was telling you, Linda, that this is my favorite chapter, because I feel like the whole book in a way is about freedom. And it's just so interesting because, grew up in the United States, which is this country that places this huge premium on freedom. And I think a lot of times when we think about freedom, we think about what I would call individual freedom. So that's our freedom to just, we get to do whatever we want, right? And it's a beautiful thing, to have autonomy and, to be able to control our own lives in a certain way. Wonderful and important. And one thing that I think a lot about is how there is a greater freedom, which is what I call collective freedom, right? Which is that we cannot just have the freedom to do anything we want all the time, but we can have the freedom to do things like take care of each other, and to give away some of our freedom so that other people, so that thousands of living things that, comprise these ecosystems, so that future generations can be more free. And I think we live in this world where, and the forests are a good place to look at this, right? We've seen that past generations have exercised their individual freedom at our expense. I say in the book, I've never had the freedom to live in a world of old growth forests, to live in a world of wolves and mountain lions, eastern elk and caribou, who are the primary herbivores on Vermont's landscape just a few hundred years ago.
I did not know that. Eastern elk and
Eastern
caribou
elk,
were
and now
here.
extinct species of elk. Yeah, but all of these things, like, those are also freedoms, and I have not had the freedom to live in a world without climate change and a biodiversity crisis and a mass extinction and all of these other things that we face. And the reason I don't have that in some cases is because, we didn't want to or couldn't restrict that individual freedom of others, and we don't want to restrict anything. But at the same time, we do have the opportunity to, mindfully and thoughtfully and compassionately, lovingly, to give up some of our freedom so that we can engage in this greater freedom, this collective freedom that to me is so much more.
So that was kind of a pie in the face for me too. Is that, I come from the Midwest where people are very conservative, and individual freedom is the thing. It's the thing. We want smaller government because we don't want somebody telling us what to do next with our land and all that stuff. But then when you were telling me about this, and when I read that freedom chapter, I thought about something that I'm asked a lot. People are, when I do my rap about the internet and treating your click as a vote, because everything we click on, we will get more of. That's just the way the internet works. If you click on something horrifying, you may be complaining about what you clicked on 5 minutes later, but you just clicked on it. So you gave it a vote, and content creators will only create what we click on. So I go on, I do my little talk about that. And then inevitably, if I'm being asked about this from a journalist, they'll say, "Oh, so are you saying that you're for censorship of the internet?" And what I always say is, yes, self-censorship. Self-censorship. We don't need more rules. We just need people to give up a little of their freedom, like you're suggesting, for the greater good.
Yeah.
We can all just shout fire in a movie theater if we want. We should have the freedom to shout anything in a movie theater, right? But is it socially responsible? Is it helpful to the world that we as an individual who might want to shout that? Is that the world we want to live in? So I think you're asking us to really look at our freedom as a gift. If we give up a little bit of it, we can give a gift to the future.
Yeah. Yeah. And I talk about it as giving it up, but then I also think that we're really not giving up anything, that we're just opening ourselves up to a different way of thinking about what freedom really is. Is freedom this thing that we do alone, that is all about us being able to just, like, we're in this race, or we're in this competition with each other? Or is freedom the opportunity to, like, use our power and our autonomy as human beings to build a better world? And so to me, I feel so much more free when I'm doing something like, spending all my time and energy trying to heal this ecosystem, this forest bear island, than I would if I was just, I don't know, trying to subdivide it off and build house lots everywhere. To me, I'm like, this is me being free, and this is me not just doing that so that I can be rich and my children and my grandchildren can be rich, but so that everyone can be rich.
But so everyone can be rich. There's a topic there that I'm not sure people know a lot about, is this conservation easements. You've put a conservation easement on your land.
Yeah. And that is it's a really great example, right? Of that collective freedom so a conservation easement, basically what it does is restrict my ability to subdivide or develop my land forever. So I donated those rights away. And in my mind, it's just such a perfect example of that, right? Because it was like, here are these freedoms. You get this land, and you get this, what we call like a bundle of rights, and you own the right to, like, do all this stuff. And no one's taken any of those rights away from me. I'm giving them away. And I'm giving them away so that future generations will be guaranteed to have this one little piece of the world still be here, right? And to have this forest that will be protected and remain a forest forever. And it just felt like, that was not me, denying myself anything, right? That was me taking this opportunity for this, tremendous freedom on behalf of us all. And what a gift. And I think that there's a lot of examples of like that, where, we do have these choices. Those of us who are privileged enough to have choices to, be able to like really make some pretty profound gifts to the future and pretty profound gifts to the world. And you could see them in one light as being at our own expense, but they're not. They're also a gift to us.
And our children and our community and everything else that nurtured us. And it's all back to your connection. There's a lot of that in this book, these reminders of our connections. Okay, there's some topics I just want to really make sure we cover because they were small aha moments for me. You have this wonderful way, you're a complex guy. You've got all these fresh thoughts. You've got life experiences that are so diverse. You have this way that you make space, to use a word that's maybe too often used, but I think it really works here. You're making space for different parts of you, and it comes out in this book a lot. So talk to us about Spud and Sparky and the bear.
Oh yeah,
all that.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I mentioned to Linda when we talked beforehand off mic that I do this type of therapy that's called internal family systems therapy, IFS. And it's been really a cool experience. I think that everybody should have a therapist if they can. And it's such a great, just, self-care thing in this world. And one of the things that IFS does is encourages you to, you sort of identify all these like parts of yourself. And these parts are just like pieces of you, different aspects of your personality, sort of, that instead of being like, this thing is a flaw, and this thing is, labeling it as one thing or another, you're just like, these are the parts of me. And these are like the family that together is me in a way, right? And so instead of saying that, oh, this part is good and this part is bad, you're trying to like negotiate a relationship with all those different things. So I had 3 parts. I write about one of them in the book named Spud, but I have 3 parts. One is called Sparky, who is my like public facing part, that when I'm doing this like social media stuff or I'm talking in front of people, it's just this like really sunny, charismatic, funny part of myself that is, by the way, a blast to inhabit, but also takes a lot of energy. And then there's another part that's named Spud. And Spud is like a work maniac who definitely doesn't care about relationships a lot, doesn't care about, any of these things that we do for ourselves. Basically is just about like, let's get this done. And Spud is the aspect of myself that has allowed me to like accomplish some really big stuff, like all the changes that I've enacted on my land by just really cranking and grinding and going for it. But also, at times isn't that fun to inhabit. And then there's a third part that I call the bear. And the bear is the part of me that's very like tender and soulful. And, the part that I would inhabit 5 o'clock in the morning, drinking my coffee right in this book. So what I say often is that the bear wrote the book, but all of those different pieces, I view to be just like aspects of myself, and it's not like I have multiple personalities. They're just all these different little shapes and shades and pieces of who I am. And I think they all contribute to everything that I do. I know they all contributed to the book. I wouldn't have been able to accomplish this book if I didn't have that really intense willpower and drive to just like keep going. Right. And I wouldn't have had the energy to like bring it to people and try to communicate in ways that resonate with people without having that sort of like sunny, outgoing part of my personality as well. And so they're like, it's cool with this book because it feels like they're all there.
It's lovely. And did want you to speak to that because I think so many of us have lives that are complex enough that if we really think about it, we're one way when we're in our working life, and we need to shift out of that to be another way, tender and so forth with our 14-year-old son. And, then we need to be another way when we're coaching, the hockey team and so forth. So, here's another one that kind of slides in sideways on this is that you said you like to inhabit contradictions.
Yeah.
I love this concept that we can all embrace.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of parallels to the forest too, right? Where it's like they are both competitive and collaborative, both individualistic and altruistic. They celebrate both life and death all of which are things that shouldn't be able to inhabit the same space, the same place. And they do. This world in which so many seemingly contradictory things are true. And, not that world is not just the forest, it's also this world. And one of the things that's why it's, fun to talk to you about my therapy and whatever, at the same time that I'm talking about like how I know how to run an excavator and how I'm like a deer hunter and, run a skidder and chainsaw and stuff, is because those things are not contradictory. And I had this feeling when I was on book tour a few months ago, and I was talking to this group of forestry students, and I told them, I was like, man, I wish that someone had told me when I was in forestry school that it was okay to be a forester and to have feelings. I spent so much time, especially as a young forester, trying to like be this, what I thought a forester was supposed to be, and being so worried that if I wasn't exactly that no one was going to take me seriously and no one was going to respect me. And, and then I'd never be able to do what I wanted to do. And so I just had these like parts of my life that I would just hide when I was at work, and parts of my personality that I would just hide. And then at some point I just realized, a forester is just whatever I am. I am that thing. And that now it's been a joy to get to, especially with young people, to get to model this different vision for what a forester is, where yes, I can be all of those like traditional forestry things. And I can also be like the lead singer of a punk band covered in tattoos, who like geeks out, loves birds, sometimes early in the spring, the first pretty songbirds that I see that have migrated back to Vermont, start crying, stuff like that. So yeah, those are all
because you are a guitarist in a punk band, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And in no way does that make me like less of a competent forester, right? I think it makes me a better one.
Yeah. And so, there's a part in the book where you are cutting down an old but diseased beech.
Mm.
And at first, this was hard because I'm going into this thinking people who cut down trees are bad people.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that, but there's that mentality that we shouldn't cut any trees. Mm-hmm. That the way to get our forest back is to not cut trees, and I'm so out of that mindset now. You've scared me straight. You just make this point that there's different ways to do forestry, and there are bad ways and good ways to.
Oh yeah,
and it's not the. But you'd have this tender 4 or 5 pages about the life of this beech and about your moment in this beech's life, cutting it down.
Yeah.
And then what was going to happen to it next and all the things. It's just, I don't know. Can you read us? Do you have a favorite part in the book? Can you read us some favorite part?
Sure. Yeah. And one thing I would say is like another one of those contradictions, right, is love trees and cut trees. And I say somewhere that only people who love trees should be allowed to cut them. Because I feel like that's like the level of seriousness that they deserve, that this action deserves, right? Where it's like, it doesn't mean that we don't do it, because in many cases it's necessary to manifest these forests, which are, so much more full of life. And and it can be many different things. So let's see here.
Because as you look that up, I just want to make a point that in the book, you become, by the end, you're like, oh my God, the only way we're going to get this forest full of life again is to cut some trees.
Yeah.
But you're so beautifully scientific about which ones need to go and which ones stay and so forth. It just all makes sense in the end.
So here's one about that idea of freedom. Freedom is a chainsaw with the potential to be so many good and terrible things. We cannot choose if we will cut into the flesh of this biosphere, cannot choose whether or not our freedom will impact the freedom of others and of future generations. All that we can do is to choose how we will live in the world we have been given. If we will treat this earth like a mine or a garden, if we will exploit and abuse it, or if we will turn toward relationship and responsibility and find a way to live with compassion. We walk back through the hayfield and toward the old house, its clapboards bobbing in a sea of goldenrod. Suddenly, I can imagine finding balance in this off-kilter world. I can envision a reality where enriching each other is as important as enriching ourselves, where freedom is something that we can only attain together. This morning, I can envision a world where we see our power and our freedom as tools to plant seeds in the earth, to offer future generations a freedom unknown to the world of today.
It's lovely. It's just so true. And I just have to tell people the whole book is like that. That's why I've got so many annotations. Like we could just sit and talk about that for a while. Line by line by line, Ethan. So, I could go on. I hope that what we accomplished in this episode of the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast is to inspire people to go pick up the book, think about how it's relevant in their own life, even if it's only metaphorical, or if you're the steward of a piece of property, start looking at what you can do to build back the beauty that was there. And it probably doesn't involve just leaving it alone. I feel so much wiser. I can't thank you enough, Ethan, for joining us and sharing it and sharing your gift with the world. I want to end on a few things. One of the things you said, the book is really good about telling you the whole truth and nothing but the truth in a beautiful way. And you say, at one point you said to me the other day, I don't feel hopeful all the time, but it's so important for me to hold hope for people. So I have to do both. Talk to us about that, because right now there's a lot of people who aren't holding out hope for the future.
Sure.
But it's important for us all to hold hope for others.
Oh, yeah.
Talk to us about that.
And we're pulling back the curtain a little bit here, because this is one of my jobs. It's not a job that anybody pays me for, but it's a job that I do as part of the purpose of my life, which is to help people see this hopeful vision for the future. And I think it's so important in so many ways, because number one, that just giving up hope doesn't get us anywhere. And it's, I believe that carrying this hopefulness is itself like an act of defiance and an act of subversion, right? And an act of revolution. And it's something that we must do, because it's also like, we don't want to just survive this moment, right? We want to thrive. We got to keep our eyes on the prize, which is not just to live in a world that is, barely here, but to live in a world that is beautiful, and to live in a world that is, such a gift, and to live in a world that is such an incredible and irreplaceable and vibrant thing. And so one of these other things that I feel like is part of my job, in the same way that I've had to step out of that imposter syndrome and those other things, is I'm it's my job to carry this message. And I tell people are here's this hopeful message, and I don't feel hopeful all the time. And I'll just say, you know what? I can be hopeful enough for both of us. And I feel like that's become part of what's important to me is to let people know that even if you don't believe it in this moment, that I can help you carry this, in any way that I can. And I think it goes back to that quote, Linda, that you said earlier, right? Like, to stop trying to be what the world expects of me and to become what the world needs. And I think it's a hard thing to do. And it's also something that a lot of us need to do if we're going to build a better world.
That's totally it. Thank you so, so much, Ethan. One of the things that I notice is giving people hope these days is when they hear somebody with a fresh idea. We can just all stay angry. We can all do the doom and gloom thing. We can talk forever about what can't happen now and all the things. But, holding a lantern, being the person who's holding the lantern on hope in a room is what we're all called to do once in a while. And you're certainly doing it with this book. I can't thank you enough. I hope that some of the concepts that Ethan and I have shared with you today will put a spring in your step for the coming week. If you get the book, take it in paragraphs and in moments, because it's that kind of book. Thank you so much, Ethan Tapper.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.